Hi, my name is Jennifer Buckingham. I am the Director of Strategy and Senior Research Fellow at Multilit. I put together this webinar for parents who want to help their children to read at home, whether they're beginning readers or whether they are developing their skills as readers. There are lots of things that parents can do to help children make progress in reading. Learning to read's a pretty complex thing. It looks easy if you're a skilled reader, and we as adult skilled readers tend to take it for granted. And it's easy to make the assumption that children will learn to read quickly and easily. Some do, some need a lot more support. But even those that learn or seem to learn quickly and easily are doing a lot of things in order to learn how to read. There are a lot of aspects of reading that need to come together for a child to be able to read fluently and to be able to comprehend what they're reading. So in this webinar, I'm going to explain why it requires quite a lot of knowledge and expertise to teach reading well, and also to give some advice to parents about how you can support your child's reading progress at home. So the 5 from 5 project started about 4 years ago. It's a not-for-profit initiative to provide information to parents and teachers and policymakers and anyone interested in reading education generally. Evidence about reading instruction and try to close the big gap really between what we know from a lot of research about how children learn to read and what are the most effective ways to teach them, and what's going on in classrooms and the way that teachers are being taught to teach reading in their teaching degrees. So that's the idea of 5 from 5. There is a website which is available to everyone who's interested, and everything on the 5 from 5 website is free of charge. The resources I'm going to be drawing on today come from the parent information section of the 5 from 5 website. So if you go to 5from5.com.au and click on the parent word up there in the menu, you'll find all of what I'm going to present to you, and also some more information as well. And there is a lot of information throughout that website that I think you would find useful. 5 from 5 is supported by Multilit, and Multilit is a producer of reading programs, particularly for schools, but we also have literacy centres to help children who are having difficulty with reading, to provide them with specialised support. So everything that Multilit does is heavily based on research and on evidence. We do a lot of research ourselves, and we produce programs that have been shown to be highly effective for whole classes of students for initial reading instruction, and also for intervention programs for children who need extra support. So the Multilit website is www.multilit.com. So this tells us a bit more about what Multilit does. We have a research unit, there's education and outreach, which is the 5 from 5 that I mentioned, and No Manners publication. There are school-based programs, but all of that information is on the website. So I'll start by explaining what I mean by the simple view of reading, and this is a model of reading. And I just finished telling you that reading is very complex, and of course it is. The simple view is a simple model of what is a complex skill, and it breaks down reading into 2 factors. It says that reading comprehension is the product of word identification and language comprehension. So by word identification, I mean the ability to see a word and read it accurately and relatively quickly. Language comprehension means vocabulary, it means understanding syntax and grammar. It's a large category of language fits into that particular factor. But essentially what it comes down to is if a child can work out what the word is, how to translate the writing on the page into a word that they can pronounce or say correctly, and then they know what that word means, then they're going to be able to read. There are other elements to text comprehension that I will talk about a little bit more as we move further through the presentation as well. But the simple view of reading is a really well validated model of reading. It's been researched very thoroughly and is widely accepted as being a good way of thinking about how to teach reading. So again, as I said, reading is that complex task, and this particular diagram is called Scarborough's reading rope, and it shows some of the other threads of what contributes to reading. So within those two categories I just mentioned, word recognition and language comprehension, there are some sub-skills that make up the ability to do those things. So for a child to be able to recognize a written word, there are certain sub-skills, phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition of words that they have become very familiar with, for example. So as we move through this presentation, a lot of those things in that what's called the reading rope will become clearer to you. Now, part of the reason that reading is so complex is that English is particularly difficult to learn. It comes from a variety of sources, so it has a very complex spelling system. So there are lots of different ways to spell what is essentially the same sound, and there are lots of different rules to learn. So when you combine the fact that there are 44 phonemes, or which are the individual sounds in speech, there are 26 letters in our alphabet, and there are 200 letter combinations that are used in order to spell words. And that is partly because of the various different language sources that have combined to make modern English what it is. Other languages like Finnish, Italian, and Spanish are easier for children to learn to read because they are still complex languages in terms of the range of words, but the way that words are spelled is much simpler. So it's much more likely that you'd be able to work out how a word is spelled just by knowing the letters of the alphabet and the simple correspondences between letters and sounds. So English really needs to be taught in an explicit and a systematic way. There's no point trying to learn every single word just by its shape or by heart, because there are hundreds of thousands of different words you'd have to learn in that way. So even though there are a lot of rules in English, there's still a lot fewer rules than there are individual words. So it's much better to learn those spelling patterns and the phonic code. Reading research has identified 5 what we call keys to reading in particular. And these are the 5 essential elements of reading instruction. And together, the first 4 keys to reading lead us towards comprehension, which is obviously our end goal. And evidence has also shown us that explicit instruction is the best way to teach those 5 keys to reading. So by explicit instruction, that means that that the lessons are teacher directed, so the teacher explains what the children need to know rather than expecting them to discover that information for themselves. The lessons are planned and they're carefully sequenced, so they are placed in a particular order that will help children to understand and to remember what they're learning. The lessons are clear and detailed. Things are broken down into small steps to help children to master the process in a logical way. There's practice for consolidation. So all of these things, modelled and guided instruction, teaching them up to mastery. The point of explicit instruction is to help children to understand and in a way that they will remember and be able to consolidate and apply that information and generalise it. Evidence-based teaching and explicit instruction are efficient ways to teach as well. So it's a way to have children learn more in a shorter space of time, because obviously there's an opportunity cost involved in methods where it takes children a longer time to learn how to do something. So explicit instruction has been proven in a lot of research studies to be that most effective and efficient way. And that's particularly true for learning phonics or the alphabetic code. It's a lot of consistent evidence around that. The first of the the keys to reading that I'll talk about is phonemic awareness. So phonemic awareness is often confused with phonological awareness, but they are two different things. Phonological awareness involves the larger parts of words. So things like syllables, so onset and rhyme, which means the first sound and then the final chunk of the word. So things like word families, onset and rhyme is, for example, in the word cat, the onset is k and the rhyme is at, and it's part of a family of words that end in the same rhyme, which is at. So cat, rat, hat, sat, and so on. They all have the same rhyme, but a different onset. And also those individual speech sounds. So they're called phonemes. And phonemic awareness is the skill that is most strongly related to children learning to read successfully and early. So phonemic awareness is particularly being able to hear the individual speech sounds in words. So again, to come back to the word cat, if you're looking at phonemes, you're looking at the individual sounds k, at. So being able to hear those sounds and isolate them and understand that those sounds map onto letters eventually is what we are hoping that children will be able to do. And there are various activities that you can do to help children to develop that. So I've included a video here that I will allow you to watch in your own time if you'd like to go back through this presentation, and just click on the play button there and watch that in your own time. But this is Alison Clark, who is showing us how to pronounce the various different speech sounds or phonemes in Australian English. Pronunciation is obviously quite important, because if you pronounce something incorrectly, then people may not recognise the word. So as I mentioned, phonemic awareness is being able to identify those distinct individual sounds. Another skill in phonemic awareness that will help children with learning to read and to spell is being able to blend phonemes together and also to rearrange them, to take phonemes away and to substitute new ones in their place. So if I asked a child to sound out the word cat, and they could tell me that sounding it out, that the sounds in that word are k, at. And I said, well, could you please take away the k and add a s? And if they can do that, if they can say at, sat, then they are displaying phonemic awareness and the ability to substitute new phonemes. So deletion and substitution is a quite complex skill. And it's one that children don't automatically develop. It's something that actually a lot of adults have difficulty with. So here we have another video. This is one on the 5 from 5 website, which is again explaining in a bit more detail about what phonemic awareness is and why it's important. So I'm not going to play that now. I've got that there for you to come back and for you to watch in your own time. The phonemic awareness or phonological awareness section of the 5 from 5 website has a lot more information and detailed information about activities that you can do with children to help them to develop that phonemic awareness in particular. So phonological awareness, so awareness of rhyme, for example, and of syllables will tend to develop earlier than phonemic awareness. And phonemic awareness is something that you can work on using lots of fun activities, in fact. So things like, even focusing on a child's name. That's one of the first words that they will recognise and be interested in talking about. So if you can talk to them about the individual sounds in their name, perhaps if you are lucky enough to have a simple name like Sam, you can practice some of those phoneme substitution activities and help children to develop that awareness and that facility to hear the sounds in words and to understand that by moving sounds around, you can create new words. So the next key to reading in that list is phonics. The phonics has a very important role in learning to read. It is very well established as being an essential aspect of reading instruction. It gets a lot of attention, and there is a lot of discussion about the best way to teach phonics. However, we do know there's ample evidence that explicit instruction in phonics is the most effective. So the reason that children need to learn phonics is because when they are starting out as readers, they need to make the connections between the words that they can see on the page and what that word sounds like, in order for them to be able to then grasp the meaning or to activate the meaning of that word. So as beginning readers, they won't look at a word and immediately know what it means. They will need to be able to say it either aloud or say it in their head. And by saying the correct word, decoding it correctly using their knowledge of letter sounds, then they will then be able to work out what that word means. So for beginning readers, that part of the learning process is a non-negotiable. They have to learn what are the spelling and the sound relationships, and then move on to meaning from that point. So phonics is the relationship between letters and sounds. So written words are a code for spoken words. So written language was developed as a way of transcribing and communicating speech. So therefore, it makes sense to go from that code-based approach to get to meaning. So phonics is teaching the relationship between letters or groups of letters, which we call graphemes, and speech sounds, which are called phonemes, hence the term phonemic awareness that we talked about before. So another little video here on phonemes and graphemes, explaining that in more detail, and showing particularly that a phoneme can be represented by a cluster of letters, and that there are different ways to represent the same sound, and that there are different ways to say or pronounce the same letter. So the alphabetic code in English is reversible, but it's also not a one-to-one relationship. There's a lot of complexity there, and which makes it all the more important to teach children that code really carefully and to make sure that they can understand it. So this is something called the ladder of reading that has been put together by Nancy Young, and it's quite well known. And Nancy is trying to get across the concept that for a large group of children, learning to read seems to be relatively easy, no matter what kind of instruction you use, and that's about a third. But there are another large group of children who will need really good instruction for them to learn quickly, because that's the aim, is to have children reading independently and proficiently relatively quickly, so they can start reading on their own and start developing their vocabulary and start reading to learn. There is also a group of children who just will not learn to read unless they're given really high quality, explicit, systematic instruction. So just to reiterate, some children will learn to read relatively easily, no matter what you do. Another group will eventually learn to read, but perhaps more slowly if you don't give them really high quality reading instruction. But then, a sizable group of children, 10 to 15% perhaps, the proportion there is debatable, but it's still a significant group. For them, reading instruction that is based on evidence and particularly looks at phonics in an explicit and systematic way is absolutely essential. So you will notice that as children start to learn the alphabetic code, that sometimes their reading just takes off. That for some children, once they've learned some of the alphabetic code, that the whole concept of reading starts to make sense to them. They start to work out for themselves or start to see the patterns in letter sound relationships. And that's called the self-teaching hypothesis. So they will see that one word that they know looks like a new word they haven't seen before, but they can work out what the pattern is. And so Dr. Seuss was really clever with helping children to do that by having a lot of nonsense words and playing around with language in his books, which helped to develop that self-teaching hypothesis. So that develops quickly for some children. Other children, it's a more meticulous process. They need to learn the entire code. That self-teaching process or hypothesis doesn't kick in as early as it does for others. Either way, though, teaching all of the letter sounds relationships is important for all children so that we can be sure that they know them, but also so that they can then apply that to spelling. Spelling is the reverse process, obviously, of reading. And it's even more complicated because coming up with the right spelling is a more difficult task than seeing a word and using the cues that they have there in the letters to work out what the word means. So a particular way of teaching phonics is called systematic synthetic phonics. Synthetic means building up the words from the smallest part of the word. So synthetic doesn't mean fake, it means synthesizing or building. The systematic aspect means that the grapheme-phoneme correspondences or the letter sound relationships are taught in a really carefully designed and developed sequence, starting off with the simpler code to the more complex one's digraph. So digraph is two letters that represent one sound. So starting off with simple letters that children can use to make simple words, and then gradually making or adding in the more complex and less obvious letter sound combinations. In synthetic phonics, children are taught to blend and segment as soon as they know a few letter sounds. So that's a really important feature of synthetic systematic phonics. So it's not a matter of you learn all of the individual sounds and graphemes and phonemes and then start to use them to build words. Word building it starts very quickly so that children grasp the point of learning all of these letters and sounds is so that they can put them together to make words, and they can start then hopefully that self-teaching process. Video here about systematic synthetic phonics for you to watch in your own time. If you want to teach children phonics at home, if they are in kindergarten or prep or pre-primary, whatever it's called in your state, if they're doing initial-it, then that will help you to work out what letters and sounds to work with them on at home. You can contact their teacher and ask them if they're doing any kind of synthetic phonics program. In fact, it will be easier for you to know where to start. What ground has been covered, what needs to be worked on, and what's next. And it's the same thing if your child's doing a mini-lit or a mac-lit program, and these are all multi-lit programs, if they all follow a defined scope and sequence. So you should be able to find out what sort of progress your child is making and to help them to work on what they've been learning. If you want to teach them phonics at home and you're not able to access the scope and sequence they're working on at school, or if they don't in fact have a phonics scope and sequence, you can go to the Phonics International website where they're providing free resources for parents for teaching children to read at home, and that's a very good option. On the 5 from 5 website, again, if you go to that parent resource section and you go to the section that says letter sounds and click on there, that will take you through to some more information about phonics and the alphabetic code, and also some links through to some apps and games that children can play. So ones that we have looked at and provided some guidance about which ones might be useful, which ones are more appropriate than others. They all have strengths and weaknesses, but there are a few good options out there that are free or relatively modest price. There are also on that website, there's some links to some videos. Again, just to give you some more information about how to go about helping children with phonics. There's a few activities that are not involving going online, which is always welcome to parents. There are lots of things that you can just do that don't require any kind of formal learning situation, just things that you can do in the car or at the dinner table or at the park when you go for a walk. Just sort of incidental activities that are fun and don't make learning phonics feel like a chore, because it's really not. Children really enjoy it. It makes sense to them and it is fun. So the third on that list is reading fluency. So fluency is the ability to read accurately, quickly, and with expression. And we know what it looks like and sounds like when a child is reading fluently. They are not reading in a robotic way. They're not having to really concentrate really hard on working out what the words are. They can read in a way that just seems much more natural. And children who are able to read in that fluent way are much more able to comprehend what they're reading, because they're able to think about the content of what they're reading about rather than trying to work out what all the words are. Children develop reading fluency the same way they develop any kind of skill, and that's with practice. And again, as with phonics, some children pick it up relatively quickly, others will need more support and more guidance, and again, much more practice. There's a few different ways to teach fluency, but the key factor that is common to all of them is modelling, practice and repetition, and feedback. So the modelling part of it is really important, because then they have an idea or a guide of what you would like them to do. And that's really an important aspect of explicit instruction in general, is not expecting children to guess what it is you would like them to do. Providing that scaffold and that model is much more likely to give them success and to make them feel secure in what they're doing. The practice and repetition element is skill building. So the more practice, the more repetition, the more improvement. And also feedback. So positive feedback is really important. Always lots of positive feedback. And if there is feedback about how to improve something, then to include that amongst the positive feedback. With audio assisted reading, which is great for parents who want to be able to do other things as well as help their children with reading instruction. It also provides a bit of variety. So with audio assisted reading, the child listens to a recording of a book, and again, something that's not too easy, not too hard, and they read along with the recording. So they can do that with headphones, or they can play it aloud, and so they don't feel quite as self-conscious about reading aloud into the silence. So that's another useful way of developing fluency. If you can't find a recording, then record yourself reading the book, either onto your phone or to any other kind of device, and then have the children read along with them. The important thing is to have the book as well. So not just trying to memorize it, but actually following on with the text to develop that reading fluency. Vocabulary. Vocabulary is the words that children need to know so they can understand what they're reading. And so they can communicate that also in their writing. So vocabulary obviously is very strongly related to reading comprehension. So in order to make meaning from a text, you need to know what the individual words mean. Of course, understanding text is more than that. It's about understanding the meaning of the words in particular contexts. There are things like idioms and phrases that are not literal meanings of the words. And so that's another element of comprehension. Vocabulary is the first step in that. The early years of school are critical, and early years rather before school as well as in school are really critical for vocabulary acquisition. Oral language tends to develop ahead of reading comprehension. So children will know a spoken word before they know it as a written word. And adults play a very significant role, obviously, in development of a child's vocabulary, the sorts of conversations that you have, and also reading together to introduce new words and to talk about them. So not to make an assumption that children know the meaning of every word that you use, and to try to use a variety of different words in conversation that introduces children to the richness of the English language, which will help them in their reading and writing. The 5 from 5 website and that parent section, again, has a lot more information about vocabulary. There are some resources there, online and otherwise. Comprehension. Comprehension is the end game. That's where we want to end up. The other 4 keys to reading lead towards that goal. But that's not all there is. So there are other sort of complex skills, things like syntax. Children need to have a reasonable amount of working memory. Working memory means their capacity to hold a thought at the front of their mind as they're learning new information, so they can make the connections between various pieces of information as they're learning them. Inferences, monitoring of understanding and their background knowledge, understanding text structure, so that's not always obvious. Which is when you're reading a sentence, for example, and the subject of the sentence isn't necessarily obvious because it's not made explicit. Those are the sorts of things that children need to know in order to be able to comprehend text. Their ability to pay attention is really important as well, and all parents understand the importance of attention in learning. Choosing appropriate books is something that I'm asked about regularly. So for children to enjoy reading and to be successful at reading, and those two things are very much linked, we need to be making sure that they have books available to them that are helping them to progress as readers and to be successful, and eventually to be able to enjoy reading any books that they choose. So to start off with, we recommend decodable books for beginning readers. And decodable books have been written in a very precise way to help children who are just starting out on the reading journey to practice their reading skills, and particularly their phonics skills. So we want to set up a habit in children that if they come across a word they don't know, to not look at the picture and guess, but to use the letters that are in the word and what they know about the letter sound correspondences to sound the word out, and to give them a really good chance of getting to accurate reading of the word. So decodable books are available in different levels of difficulty, and so they get more complex as children develop their skills and progress through learning the alphabetic code, and children often progress through them very quickly. They're not supposed to be the only part of a children's reading diet. So by recommending decodable books, I'm certainly not saying that is the only sort of books that children should have. Storybooks are still a really important part of shared reading. Decodable books have a particular purpose, and that is for reading practice while children are first developing their reading skills. Multilit has produced a really beautiful range of decodable books called Initial Lit Readers. There's 60 books in the series, and more are being written right now. They're organised into levels of difficulty according to the Initial Lit scope and sequence. Initial Lit is the Multilit reading program for foundation through to year 2. That's for use in schools. But the decodable books are lovely books that can be used in any classroom, whether it's an Initial Lit classroom or not, or can be used at home. So they're available online. There's 2 examples there. Red Ted is at the simpler end of the scale, and The Lost Pup, more difficult, but still having children use their phonics skills. There are a limited number of words in decodable readers that children can't use phonics to decode. There will be a few words that are a little more irregular, that they just need to learn as whole words, but most of them are words that they can decode and use their phonics skills to read. Picture books are still, as I mentioned, a very important part of reading development, and they have language that is not always found in everyday language. So words that are complex and that are rich in terms of their meaning, and it's great to read these with children, particularly in the beginning stages, but you shouldn't expect children to be able to read them to you, because there will be words in storybooks and picture books that are well beyond, particularly if they're beginning readers, well beyond what they've been learning in terms of the phonic code. And so if you're asking children to read picture books or storybooks that are too difficult for them, that can lead to frustration, both from parents and children. So picture books and storybooks for beginning readers are books to be read with children. And by all means, it's not a matter of locking them in the cupboard and saying, you must not read these. They should read, look at them and enjoy them and attempt them if they want to, but there shouldn't be that expectation that they are used for reading practice. Chapter books are books that have more text than they have pictures, and they start to have pages without pictures. So they're quite a big step up in terms of children's reading ability. They require more stamina and more fluency, because if you're a struggling reader who is having to be careful and look at every word in detail in order to be able to read it, then chapter books are going to seem quite daunting. But children who are making typical progress in reading can usually attempt simpler chapter books around year 2. Some of the more precocious readers are already well into Harry Potter in year 2. But most children, if they are making good progress, can read some of the simpler chapter books at around about that age, and then start to progress onto the books that are more well known. Finding the right books is really important, particularly for children who are reluctant readers. So Louise Park, who is the author of some great series of books that are chapter books for children in primary school, the Harriet Clare series, Act Power and Boy vs Beast books that are very popular. She has written an article on the 5 from 5 website, I've given you the link there, about how to go about choosing books for kids. Some of the things to keep in mind: one is the content, obviously, that kids have certain preferences in terms of the sorts of things they want to read about. The readability is a really important factor, is that you don't want to try to have a child read something that is well beyond what their ability level is, because that will lead to frustration and be counterproductive. We want them to be successful and enjoy reading as much as possible, and to give them some choice. So that's just a very broad breakdown, and there's a lot more detail on that page about choosing books. And what about if your child has difficulty with reading? And there are a lot of children who struggle at various points in their reading development, and some struggle for longer than others. It's not the case that all children will eventually catch up. There are some clear signs relatively early in school that a child might be having some difficulty with reading. If they have difficulty with phonemic awareness, that's one indicator that they might have some struggling episodes with reading. But there are some ways to be able to tell if a child is struggling with reading. If you can speak to their teacher to express your concerns, and that's always the first step. The 5 from 5 website has some guidance for parents about the steps that they can take if they think that their child might be struggling with learning to read, and it's never wrong to question that and to seek some help. And either your fears may not be confirmed, but the longer you leave a struggling reader to struggle, the harder it's going to be for them to catch up. So I think parents generally have pretty good instincts around that. So it's a good idea to follow that up if you are concerned. If you, after having talked to your child's teacher and followed through some of those other guidance steps on the 5 from 5 website, if you still have concerns, or if it's been confirmed that there is a reading difficulty with your child, the multi-lit literacy centres will be able to help. They can do a very specific assessment of the child's reading difficulty, pinpoint exactly what aspect of reading is causing them problems. Sometimes it's multiple aspects and sometimes it is one, and more often than not, particularly for young children, it's decoding. So the literacy centres can offer that support and assessment, and then also there are programs that can be done both in the literacy centre, so a child can attend for one-on-one tutoring in the literacy centre, or they can be done online. So that both of the literacy centres at the moment are in Sydney, but for people who don't live in Sydney, there are online options available which have been very successful. There is data and published statistics on the multi-lit website, which details the progress that children make in that program. So for parents, the key messages for helping your children at home with reading is a little different, but depending on how old your children are. So for beginning readers or children who are struggling with some of the basic aspects of reading, like decoding, that's really the first step. In order to be able to understand what they're reading, children need to be able to work out accurately what the word is. And then that leads on to fluency, which can then lead on to comprehension. So working on letter sound knowledge and decoding, so that blending skill is really important. The other element is developing vocabulary by looking for new words, both in environmental print, so that is, on signs or on newsletters, or if you're reading a news website, or there are lots of different ways you can encounter new words, talking about them, different meanings of them, what are the opposites, so synonyms and antonyms. So just having it, playing around with words and introducing new vocabulary, but then also repeating that as much as possible, finding ways to introduce that word into your own vocabulary so that they're being exposed to it as often as possible. And last but certainly not least is reading together in a way that's enjoyable and relaxed, and exploring books that a child may not necessarily choose for themselves. One way to do it is that they choose one book and you choose one book. Children tend to have sometimes quite narrow tastes in the sorts of books that they like, and you can find yourself reading the same book 3 times a day, every day for a month, which there's nothing wrong with that, but there should be, some other books in there as well. So by all means, read the same book every day, but read a different book every day as well. So that might be the bargain that you strike. For older children who are reading fluently, there is still room for extending that ability, particularly through building and extending vocabulary, those tier 2 words and tier 3 words. There's lots of different ways of doing that. Continuing to read together in upper primary is a really great thing to do. Don't stop reading to and with children once they are independently reading, because you can really help them to expand their repertoire and their interests if you continue to share books with them and read with them. Trying to have as much variety as possible, fiction and non-fiction. Background knowledge and general knowledge is an important factor in reading comprehension, and just in learning in general, non-fiction can introduce children to lots of interesting knowledge about the world. And reading books that are a little more difficult than they might choose to read for themselves. So maybe one step above their comfort level, and read that book with them. And sometimes children will just pick it up and run with it. So there are some classic books, things like Treasure Island, where the language is really quite old-fashioned and complex, but the vocabulary and the phrasing is really wonderful. Children might struggle to read that on their own, but if you read it with them, they're much more likely to enjoy it and benefit from it. So they're the 3 takeaway messages for younger children and older children. Obviously, throughout the rest of this presentation, there's been a lot more detail. And as I've said, throughout the presentation, there is an enormous amount more detail on the 5 from 5 website, and also on the Multilit website, where there are publications with lots of great articles about reading instruction. This slide here gives some websites for you to follow up with some further reading, and also organisations that can provide some support if you're worried about your child's reading progress. That should keep you going for several months worth of reading if you read everything on all of those sites. That there is a wealth of knowledge out there about reading instruction. As parents, you're not expected to know all of it, but you really are well placed to help your children with learning to read. And it's an enjoyable thing to do and very rewarding. Thank you.